Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 22nd of February of 2024. Today we have significant number of very interesting details and updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about new Avdiivka direction. Today we got one of the most important and significant update, and the Russians are saying that as a result of very heavy clashes, as a result of very fierce offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over Sieverne. To be more precise, the first legendary brigade, Slavianskaya brigade, established control, and this report was published today somewhere at 7:15 of the local time, at 7:15 p.m. So this is the village Sieverne. This is the area. This area used to be under the responsibilities of 116th Mechanized Brigade of Armed Forces of Ukraine, of 53rd Brigade, but very likely those brigades were defeated and were forced to step back. For now, we haven't received, let's call it, any geolocated proofs of that control, but so for this video we will adjust the map and we will show approximate Russian control in this territory and the results of Russian attacks that very likely took place during the previous 24 hours. And this is the situation. So once again, the Russians are moving further. This situation completely changed the entire line of combat contact, and now the Ukrainians have significant problems in Lastochkina, because during the previous days the Russians were attacking Lastochkina mainly from the chemical plant, and the Ukrainians managed to repel every single Russian attack. And the reason of that, those successful let's say repellings, were that the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians, and there is a water barrier between that split Lastochkina in two parts. This is the water barrier. So that's why the Ukrainians had their positions on the southern part in this area, and they felt themselves pretty comfortable, and they managed to repel every single Russian attack, and the Russians were forced to step back. But now the Russians, after the Russians established control over the southern part, over the Sieverne, now the Russians can continue movements to the north and to collapse the Ukrainians in Lastochkina. So obviously, if the information about Sieverne is correct, obviously during this upcoming night, the Ukrainians will abandon their positions in the village and they will move further to the west in direction of Orlovka. So we'll see, and obviously we're going to start receiving this update probably even this night. Also very likely that the Ukrainians will make the same thing from Toninka and also will abandon their positions towards Umanskaya. So we can say that very likely that by the end of the weekend the Russians will be able to establish control over Lastochkina, Sieverne and Toninka. So all these cities and villages will be captured by the Russians, and by the end of the Sunday very likely we're going to see something like this on this direction. This is going to be a very big disaster for the Ukrainians, because the Russians first of all will be able to maintain the line of combat contact, they will be able to release significant number of forces, and the Russians will open the gate and will be able to concentrate their further offensive in direction of Pervomaiskaya. Furthermore, don't forget that during the previous 24 hours the Russians were attacking the positions of Ukrainian forces between Berdichi and Orlovka. And for those purposes, the Russians were using the chemical plant as the base of that attack, as the beginning point, the start point of those attacks. Currently, the Russians are trying to establish control over these strongholds that located along the tree lines between Stepova and Lastochkina. But now there is no Lastochkina anymore, or there are going to be no Lastochkina by the morning. So, and the main purpose of this attack from the Russian side is to maintain this gray zone, to maintain the line of combat contact, and to connect Stepova with the chemical plant. So this approximately the Russian goals on this direction, and very likely the Russians are able to achieve these results also very soon. And then the main clashes for the second main defense belt will start. For example, Avdiivka was the first defense belt that was collapsed very fast within 3-4 months. Now the Russians are grinding the positions between the second defense belt. I'll remind you that where is the second defense belt. This is it. Очеретина, Бердичи, Семеновka, Orlyanka, and then to the west to Umanskaya, along the water reservoirs, rivers, and so on. So probably within the next few days the Russians will reach this defense belt, and if the Russians are able to collapse this defense belt as well, then I can't even say where exactly the Ukrainians are able to stop the Russians. Maybe somewhere on the Dnipro River or something like this. Anyway, we'll see what is going to be next. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the total losses on Avdiivka direction were around 145 soldiers. If you can see, the level of losses is minimal in comparison with the day before yesterday. In the previous 3 days there were 565, 425, 450, and today 145. So you may ask why there is such a big difference between the days, and today the Russians captured Sieverne and we see the lowest level of losses. I'll explain to you that during the previous 3 days the Russians not just attacked Sieverne, Orlovka, Lastochkina, all these cities and villages. The Russians were conducting the clearing operation inside of Avdiivka, and the reason of those heavy losses from the Ukrainian side was completely connected with significant number of wounded and prisoners of war that the Russians managed to capture, to find during the previous 3 days. So that's why the level of losses was so big. Now the Russians completed the clearing operation, so that's why the level of losses was reduced in 3 times or something like this. So this is the situation in Avdiivka direction. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of Krasnogorovka and Mariinka, Pobeda, Novomikhailivka. We haven't received lots of updates in comparison with the previous video. The important thing that we should discuss is that, if you remember, yesterday we were talking that the Russians managed, according to Rybar, the Russians managed to establish control over the first streets of Krasnogorovka. This morning, additional Russian resource reported about some progress, but that the Russians haven't entered Krasnogorovka. And today we got some geolocated proofs of Russian focus in this area. For example, on this video we can see of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians with FABs, with artillery. So those positions that, according to Rybar and other reliable sources, were captured by the Russians. Just today we got the video of geolocated videos of how the Russians were bombing and conducting artillery preparations. So very likely, once again, based on these videos, very likely that the Russians did manage to establish control over something like this. Anyway, sooner or later we're going to receive more details, and then we will adjust the map and to show the real situation on the ground. Furthermore, we got additional video from Nivoiska itself. This is the northern flank of Krasnogorovka. Another video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces inside of Nivoiska. And if we increase the numbers of this just for 1 week, we're gonna see that that was not the only video from this direction. This is the second video from the same area. So during the previous week, the Russians were over concentrated on this area, which confirms that very likely within the next few days the Russians will make the first attempt to attack and storm the village itself. And if the Russians are able to capture this territory and to get the western outskirts and the western edge of the village, obviously the problems will start rising in Krasnogorovka. So the situation once again continued developing not in Ukraine's favor, and the situation is getting worse and worse for them. Furthermore, the Russians reported that as a result of FAB strikes, they managed to completely destroy the Kurakhova power plant and to shut down the entire region from the electricity. And now we see that during this difficult period of time, the Ukrainians neither have ammo, supplies, support, raise fresh forces, and now they're out of electricity, which will also affect their possibilities of communication, maybe Starlinks and so on. So we'll see what is going to be next. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours they attacked and bombed Ukrainian positions in the deep rear. For example, in the city by the name of Dobropilya, the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian ammo depot, and as a result of Geraň strike, that ammo depot was destroyed and we see a very powerful explosion. We have 2 videos from this direction. That was the one. This is the second one from another angle. This local civilian was making a video. If you have sound, you can hear the sound of Geraň, and then it was strike and a very heavy explosion. So the Russian control not just the line of combat contact, the Russians also tried to control the deep rear. When talking about Novomikhailivka, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything from this direction. Just few mortar positions were hit or destroyed, few artillery systems were destroyed behind Konstantinovka, so nothing special. Currently there are very heavy clashes, but we don't have any things, any geolocations, any reports from the ground to make any projections or to make any conclusions. We see something like intensifying of activity on Staromayorsk direction, on Velika Novoselovka direction. The Russians renew their bombing and attacking of Urozhaine and Staromayorsk with heavy artillery, with aviation, with stealth and tower systems. And these are not the first updates from this area for the previous few weeks. Something tells me that the Russians are going to launch at least short attacks on this direction either. So in this video we can see the Russians discovered the positions and start bombing them with multi-launch rocket systems. A little bit further to the north we got the video of how the Russians were bombing Urozhaine, probably with something very heavy, maybe total tower systems, or maybe with FAB, or maybe with Tornado S. very interesting. Now we are moving to Robotyne. We have additional updates from the territory. We don't have any geolocations that can give us any understanding of the line of combat contact and where currently the clashes are taking place. The only thing we have is the report from Rybar. The Rybar reported that by the let's say 3 p.m. of the local time, the Russians managed to penetrate the first defense belt of the Ukrainian forces in the southern part of Robotyne. The Russians established control over these trenches. The Russians entered Robotyne, and by let's say 1 p.m. 3 p.m. of the local time, the clashes were taking place along the streets, so in the vicinity of the old and destroyed school, somewhere here. And Rybar made a conclusion that if the Russians are able to establish control over this territory and to capture something like this, and if the Russians are able to repel, let's say, Ukrainian counterattacks that maybe that currently are taking place or will take place during the upcoming night, then the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from the central part to the northern part or to the northeastern part. But very unlikely the Ukrainians are able to hold the territories, and very likely that if the situation develops this way, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back to Novodanilovka, because there are no chances to control the northern part, because the main supply road that goes through 0408 road is under complete Russian FPV drone control, and everything that used this road would be destroyed by the Russians. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. We got additional very interesting reports, and the most important is that Ukrainians concentrated significant number of HIMARS launching system in this area, and during just the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians published significant number of HIMARS strikes, and of course that means something. I believe that the Ukrainians try to show the Russians that the Russians don't have control over Krynki by this action, or maybe the Ukrainians are planning to renew or to make another attempt to land in Krynki and to capture additional village or streets or something like this, because we see this intensifying of actions after Putin and Shoigu reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village, and probably the Ukrainians tried to revenge or something like this. I don't know. From the most important is there was a video published today, and there was the Ministry of Defense report also published today that the Russians managed to, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover the Ukrainian Patriot system. This is the Patriot system that was moving along the roads in Kherson direction, and the Russian drones followed the Patriot, and they provided the details and coordinates of the base of ammo depots, and after that the Russians destroyed every single target that was provided by the Russian reconnaissance teams. Lots of ammo depots, lots of warehouses were destroyed by the Russians. According to information we have, another Patriot system basically was destroyed. And later we got a very interesting analysis from the Ukrainian sources. They're saying that for the previous 9 months, the Western countries provided the Ukrainians up to 7 Patriot systems, and 5 of them were destroyed. And according to this source, the average cost of each Patriot system varies from $1 to $1.5 billion. And when talking about the missiles, parts, and different things for Patriot system that were destroyed during the previous 9 months, the cost of the losses is around $15 billion. So if we combine everything during just the previous 9 months, the Ukrainians lost up to 20 billions just when talking about the Patriot systems and so on. Furthermore, the Western sources reported that as a result of that Patriot hunting that we just was watching, the Ukrainians lost up to 40 soldiers of personnel, including 20 soldiers or officers of United Kingdom, and there were lots of tens of wounded and so on. Now we are moving back to Kupiansk, to Bakhmut-Artyomovsk direction. We have a lot of very interesting details from this territory as well. The Russians launched the ground operation in direction of Ivanivske. We got significant number of geolocations. Meanwhile, one Russian forces are moving and pushing and attacking the Ukrainian positions and strongholds between Chasov Yar and Popovo Forest, where I'm talking about this territory. Another Russian group started the ground operation in direction of Ivanivske itself. And we start receiving this evening more details and updates about the current situation. Before the beginning of offensive operation, the Russians published the video of artillery strikes and TOS flamethrower system strikes in this area. The Russians managed to deal significant damage. They suppressed the rest of Ukrainian positions, or those who left in this area, because if you remember, during the previous few days in a row, the Russians were publishing the artillery strikes from this area. So that's why we can make a conclusion that significant number of of Ukraine positions were suppressed and destroyed. And after artillery preparation, the Russians launched the ground operation. We haven't received any geolocated video confirmation of clashes inside of the village, but let's say at 2 p.m. of the local time, we got the first update that since the beginning of the morning of 22nd of February, there were very heavy clashes between Ukrainians and between the Russians on the northern and the northeastern part of the village. Later at around 4 p.m. of the local time, we got report that the Russians managed to enter and to dig in deeper on Sadovaya Street, and this information was confirmed by some messages from different Telegram channels from different resources. So if we combine and summarize everything, but at the end of the 22nd of February, we can see something like this in Ivanivske and on the outskirts of Ivanivske. So we received this report or something like this a few days ago, but probably those were something like reconnaissance and force in combat, and today the Russians conducted the real offensive operation with the purpose to completely collapse the Ukrainian defense belt in the village and to establish control over this territory. So we'll see what is going to be next, but obviously the situation in this area also develops not in Ukrainian favor. Now we are moving to Kupiansk direction. We got a lot of very interesting details that I would like to discuss with you. First of all, I'll remind you that the Russians combined the Liman front line and Kupiansk front line into one front line and called this Kupiansk direction. And we have very interesting analysis from the Institute of Study of War. The Institute of Study of War is saying that the Russians start using or start preparation for completely different operation that they haven't conducted since the beginning of the special military operation. The things that we're going to see on Kupiansk direction are going to be something new that we haven't seen before from the Russian side. What are they trying to say? If we remember the previous Russian operations like Bakhmut offensive operation, we can say that the length of the line of combat contact, the length of operational area was around 30 kilometers. So this is the length of operational area of Russian offensive operation in direction of Bakhmut. When talking about Avdiivka, there we can see the same story. The operational length of the Avdiivka front line during the active phase of clashes was around 30 kilometers. Now we see an active offensive operation in direction of Novomikhailivka, and the length of, let's say, of operational area, let's say starting from Marinka to Pobeda, then to Novomikhailivka and to the south in direction of the road between Solotka and Vadiana is around 30 kilometers. So I'm trying to say that until the 22nd of February, when the Russians were conducting this or that offensive operation, they were using just a 30 kilometers operational area. So that was like the top and limits of their possibilities and capabilities. They didn't try to use bigger front lines because there may be lots of risk, and basically they didn't have enough of experience. But after 2 years of special military operation, the Russians probably obtained additional level of experience, and now they're ready for something more. And if we move back to Kupiansk direction, and if we calculate the line of combat contact in the line and the length of operational area, we're gonna see that the distance, that the length of this front line is around, starting from Sinkovka to Sieversky Donetsk River, is around 120 kilometers. And the Russians are planning to use this entire length for offensive operation. Every single second, every single minute, every single city, every single town in this direction is scheduled and inside of the Russian plan. This is not going to be something like a separate operation in Kupiansk and separate operation in Liman. This is going to be one big operation, one big offensive operation, as we used to see during the Second World War. Of course, it's still too far for even a single operation in the Second World War, but this is very big and something new that the Russians are planning to show not just to the Ukrainians, but obviously to the NATO officers. And this is exactly what the Institute of Study of War was trying to tell us by their analysis. Something new is going to happen. And of course, during the day, we got a lot of updates about significant number of reinforcement that Ukrainians are sending on this direction from Dnipro, from Kramatorsk. A lot of forces, a lot of reinforcements was sent there. The Russians start bombing the reinforcements on their way, on the railways. We got reports about significant concentration of Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Kovsharovka. So something big is going to happen. But another important thing is that, according to the Ministry of Defense report, the Russians, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost just 30 soldiers on this direction. This is the minimal level of losses, and it's not just today, just during the previous 5 days, we can say that there were the minimal level of losses since the beginning of the special military operation, because Kupiansk direction, it's not just Kupiansk, it's also Liman. And I'll remind you that we stopped receiving any updates from Liman direction, from former Liman direction in the area of Terny Yampulovka, which confirms that the Russians took operational pause, and there are few options. Either the Russians are about to finish the preparation before that big attack according to Institute of Study of War, or they're about to finish, or in the process, and this process will be finished right now or already finished. So obviously, according to the most of experts, Kupiansk direction is going to be main direction during the next 3-4 months, and the Russians will try to show us something new. Let's see. Anyway, we got interesting report also from Kiev, and this report bypassed, nobody mentioned this report, and this is very interesting. Zelensky gave to Ukraine parliament another law for voting for adoption, and currently there is a law of demobilization. So the Ukrainians want to release significant number of soldiers from the line of combat contact and to send them back home. Those soldiers who have been fighting in Ukraine since the beginning, since 2022, so up to 2 years, Zelensky wants to send them back home. And this is a very smart step, because by demobilization law, Zelensky will be able to complete and to fix a lot of issues. First of all, he will increase his ratings among the soldiers, because it's like demobilization, and this is very good for a soldier. First thing. The second thing, obviously, the soldiers that will be demobilized, they will be used by Zelensky as the forces for next mobilization. So it's like one will return back from the line of combat contact, and of course they will be motivated to collect as many as possible people, soldiers, and to send them back to the front line, because it's fair. Why I fought on the front line, why I were losing my friends, soldiers, and you were on, let's say, in Kiev on the parties or something like this. I thought that then you will fight as well. So he has experience, and he's not like commissar or person right now, military person, who tried to mobilize without any experience on the ground. Of course, he's not motivated. This is the second situation, and this process will force also this very smart step. This situation can also force Russia to make demobilization as well, because the Russian soldiers will also look at the Ukrainian situation, and they will start asking questions of Russian authorities, when are we going to have demobilization? But from the other side, this situation can lead to Russian demobilization and to another Russian mobilization as well. So as I understand, the most important things are going to just to start happening, and we'll see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.